Death of Magellan. Duarte Barbosa, Magellan's brother-in-law, and Juan Serrano were elected commanders by the Spaniards, who were destined to meet with further catastrophes. The slave who had acted as interpreter up to this time had been slightly wounded during the battle. From the time of his master's death, he had kept aloof, not rendering any further service to the Spaniards and remaining extended upon his mat. After some rather sharp reproofs from Barbosa, who told him that his master's death did not make him a free man, he disappeared all at once. He was gone to the newly baptized king, to whom he declared that if he could allure the Spaniards into some trap and then kill them, he would make himself master of all their provisions and merchandise. Serrano, Barbosa, and 27 Spaniards were accordingly invited to a solemn assembly to receive the presents destined by the king of Zebu for the emperor. During the banquet, they were attacked unexpectedly and were all massacred except Serrano, who was led bound to the seashore, where he besought his companions to ransom him, for if they did not he would be murdered. But Juan de Carvalho and the others, fearing that the insurrection would become general and that they might be attacked during the negotiations by a numerous fleet which they would not be able to resist, turned a deaf ear to the unfortunate Serrano's supplications. The ships set sail and reached the island of Bohol, which was not far distant. When there, thinking that their numbers were too much reduced to navigate 3 vessels, they burnt the Conception, after having transshipped all that was most precious on board the other vessels. Then, after having coasted along the island of Panalongan, they stopped at Butuan, which forms part of Mindanao, a magnificent island with numerous ports and rivers abounding in fish, to the northwest of which lies the island of Luzon, the most considerable of the archipelago. The ships touched also at Palon, where they found pigs, goats, fowls, different kinds of bananas, coconuts, sugar canes, and rice, with which they provisioned the ships. This was for them, as Pigafetta expresses it, a promised land. Among the things which he thought worthy of notice, the Italian traveler mentions the cocks kept by the natives for fighting, a passion which after so many years is still deeply rooted amongst the population of the whole Philippine archipelago. From Palon, the Spaniards next went to the island of Borneo, the center of Malay civilization. From that time, they had no longer to deal with poverty-stricken people, but with a rich population who received them with magnificence. Their reception by the Raja is sufficiently curious to warrant a few words being devoted to it. At the landing place, they found 2 elephants with silk trappings, who bore the strangers to the house of the governor of the town, while 12 men carried the presents which were to be offered to the Raja. From the governor's house, where they slept, to the palace of the king, the streets were kept by armed men. Upon descending from their elephants, the Spaniards were admitted to a room filled with courtiers. At the end of this room opened another smaller room, hung with cloth of gold, in which were 300 men of the king's guard armed with poniards. Through a door they could then see the Raja, sitting by a table with a little child chewing betel nut. Behind him there were only some women. Etiquette required that the petition to be made must pass in succession through the mouths of 3 nobles, each of higher rank than the last, before being transmitted, by means of a hollow cane placed in a hole in the wall, to one of the principal officers, who submitted it to the king. Then there was an exchange of presents, after which the Spanish ambassadors were conducted back to their vessels with the same ceremony as on their arrival. The capital is built on piles in the sea, so that when the tide rises, the women who sell provisions go about the town in boats. On the 29th of July, more than 100 canoes surrounded the 2 vessels, whilst at the same time some junks weighed anchor to approach them more nearly. The Spaniards, fearing to be treacherously attacked, took the initiative and fired off their artillery, which killed a number of people in the canoes, upon which the king excused himself, saying that his fleet had not been directed against them, but against the Gentiles with whom the Mussulman had daily combats. This island produces arak, the alcohol of rice, camphor, cinnamon, ginger, oranges, citrons, sugar canes, melons, radishes, onions, and sea. The articles of exchange are copper, quicksilver, cinnabar, glass, woolen cloths, and canvas, and above all iron and spectacles, without mentioning porcelain and diamonds, some of which were of extraordinary size and value. The fauna comprises elephants, horses, buffaloes, pigs, goats, and domestic poultry. The money in use is of bronze. It is called sape and consists of small coins which are perforated with holes, that they may be strung together. On leaving Borneo, the travelers sought for a suitable spot in which to repair their vessels, which were in such great need of it that the men were not less than 42 days over the work. The oddest things which I have found in this island, says Pigafetta, are the trees of which all the leaves are animated. These leaves resemble those of the mulberry, but are not so long. The stalk is short and pointed, and near the stalk on both sides there are 2 feet. If you touch the leaves, they escape, but when crushed, no blood comes from them. I have kept one of them in a box for 9 days. When I opened the box, the leaf was walking about in it. I believe they must live upon air. These very curious animals are well known at the present day, and are commonly called leaf flies, Mouch's fuel. They are of a gray-brown, which makes them more easily mistaken for dead leaves, which they exactly resemble in appearance. It was while in these parts that the Spanish expedition, which, during Magellan's life, had preserved its scientific character, began perceptibly to become piratical. Thus, on several occasions, junks were seized upon, and their crews forced by their Spanish captors to pay large ransoms. The ships next passed by the archipelago of the Sulu Islands, the haunt of Malay pirates, who have even now only lately submitted to the Spanish arms. Then by Mindanao, which had been already visited, for it was known that the eagerly sought-for Moluccas must be in its neighborhood, whether more or less remote. At last, after having seen a number of islands, of which the names would not convey much idea to us, on Wednesday, the 6th of November, the Spaniards discovered the archipelago, about which the Portuguese had related such terrifying fables, and 2 days later they landed at Tidor. Thus the object of the voyage was attained. The king came to meet the Spaniards, and invited them to go on board his canoe. He was seated under a silk parasol which covered him entirely. In front of him were placed one of his sons, who carried the royal scepter, 2 men who had each a golden vase full of water for washing the king's hands, and 2 others holding small gilt boxes filled with betel. Then the Spaniards made the king come on board the vessels, where they showed him much respect, at the same time loading him and those who accompanied him with presents, which seemed to them very precious. This king is a Moor, that is to say, an Arab, Pigafetta affirms. He is nearly 45 years of age, tolerably well made, and with a fine physiognomy. His clothing consisted of a very fine shirt, the cuffs of which were embroidered in gold. Drapery descended from his waist to his feet. A silk veil, no doubt a turban, covered his head, and upon this veil there was a garland of flowers. His name is Raja Sultan Manzur. The next day, in a long interview which he had with the Spaniards, Manzur declared his intention of placing himself with the islands of Ternate and Tidor under the protection of the King of Spain. The Sultan Manzur. The Sultan Manzur. This is the place to give some details about the archipelago of the Moluccas, drawn from Pigafetta's narrative, which we are following step by step in the version that M. ed. Charton has given, and to which he has added such valuable notes. This archipelago, properly speaking, comprises the islands of Gilolo, Ternate, Tidor, Mornay, Batchian, and Missal, but the Banda and Ambana groups are also often comprehended under the general name of Molucca. Formerly convulsed by repeated volcanic commotions, this archipelago contains a great number of craters, almost all extinct, or in repose during a long succession of years. The air there is burning, and would be almost unfit to breathe if frequent rains did not fall and refresh the atmosphere. The natural productions are extremely valuable. In the first rank must be placed the sago tree, of which the pith called sago takes, with yams, the place of cereals throughout Malacca. As soon as the tree is cut down, the pith is extracted, which is then grated, passed through a sieve, and afterwards cut up in the form of small rolls, which are dried in the shade. There are also the mulberry, the clove, the nutmeg, the camphor and pepper trees, in fact all the spice trees and all the tropical fruits. The forests contain some valuable kinds of wood, ebony, ironwood, teak, famous for its strength, and employed from the most ancient times in costly buildings, and the Calilaban laurel, which yields an aromatic essential oil that is highly prized. At this period domestic animals were not numerous in the Moluccas, but among the wild animals the most curious were the babirausa, an enormous wild boar with long tusks bent backwards, the opossum, a kind of didelphys a little larger than our squirrel, the phalanger, a marsupial which lives in thick, dark forests where it feeds upon leaves and fruit, and the tarsier, a kind of jerboa, a very harmless, inoffensive little animal with reddish-colored hair, about the size of a rat, but whose body bears some resemblance to that of an ape. Among the birds, the most remarkable were the paroquets and cockatoos, the birds of paradise of which so many fabulous accounts were given, and which until then had been believed to be without legs, the kingfishers, and the cassowaries, great wading birds almost as large as ostriches. A Portuguese named Lourosa had been long settled in the Moluccas, and to him the Spaniards forwarded a letter, in the hope that he would betray his country and attach himself to Spain. They obtained the most curious information from him with regard to the expeditions which the King of Portugal had dispatched to the Cape of Good Hope, to the Rio de la Plata, and to the Moluccas, but from various circumstances these latter expeditions had not been able to take place. He himself had been 16 years in this archipelago. The Portuguese had been installed there for 10 years, but upon this fact they preserved the most complete silence. When Lourosa saw the Spaniards making their preparations for departure, he came on board with his wife and his goods to return to Europe. On the 12th of November, all the merchandise destined for barter was landed, it being chiefly derived from the 4 junks which had been seized in Borneo. Certainly, the Spaniards traded to great advantage, but nevertheless not to so great an extent as they might have done, for they were in haste to return to Spain. Some vessels from Gilolo and Batchian came also to trade with them, and a few days later they received a considerable stock of cloves from the King of Tidor. This king invited them to a great banquet which he said it was his custom to give when a vessel or junk was loaded with the first cloves. But the Spaniards, remembering what had happened to them in the Philippines, refused the invitation while presenting compliments and excuses to the king. When their cargo was completed, they set sail. Scarcely had the Trinidad put to sea before it was perceived that she had a serious leak, and the return to Tidor as fast as possible was unavoidable. The skillful divers, whom the king placed at the disposal of the Spaniards, were unable to discover the hole, and it became necessary to partly unload the ship to make the necessary repairs. The sailors who were on board the Victoria would not wait for their companions, and the ship's officers, seeing clearly that the Trinidad would not be fit for the voyage to Spain, decided that she should go to Darien, where her valuable cargo would be discharged and transported across the isthmus to the Atlantic, where a vessel would be sent to fetch it. But neither the unfortunate vessel nor her crew was destined ever to return to Spain. The Trinidad, commanded by the alguazil Gonzalo Gomez de Espinosa, who had Juan de Carvalho as pilot, was in so bad a state that after leaving Tidor, she was obliged to anchor at Ternate, in the port of Talangomi, where her crew, consisting of 17 men, was immediately imprisoned by the Portuguese. The only reply given to Espinosa's remonstrances was a threat to hang him to the yard of a vessel, and the unfortunate alguazil, after having been transferred to Cochin, was sent to Lisbon, where for 7 months he remained shut up in the prison of the Limoeiro with 2 Spaniards, the sole survivors of the crew of the Trinidad. As to the Victoria, she left Tidor richly laden under the command of Juan Sebastian del Cano, who, after having been simply a pilot on board one of Magellan's ships, had taken the command of the Conception on the 27th of April, 1521, and who succeeded to Juan Lopez de Carvalho when the latter was superseded in his command for incapacity. The crew of the Victoria was composed of only 53 Europeans and 13 Indians. 54 Europeans remained at Tidor on board the Trinidad. After passing amidst the islands of Caon, La Goma, Sico, Geoffy, Caffi, Labon, Toloman, Batchian, Mata, and Batu, the Victoria left this latter island to the west, and steering west-southwest, stopped during the night at the island of Zulla or Zulla. At 30 miles from thence, the Spaniards anchored at Boro, the Boero of Bougainville, where the ship was revictualled. They stopped miles further on, at Banda, where mace and nutmegs are found, then at Sala, where a great trade in white sandalwood is carried on. They spent a fortnight there to repair their ship, which had suffered much, and there they laid in an ample provision of wax and pepper. Then they anchored at Timor, where they could only obtain provisions by retaining by stratagem the chief of the village and his son, who had come on board the ship. This island was frequented by junks from Luzon and by the praus from Malacca and Java, which traded largely there in sandalwood and pepper. A little further on, the Spaniards touched at Java, where, as it appears, suttee was practiced at this time, as it has been in India until quite recently. Among the stories which Pigafetta relates, without entirely believing them, is one which is most curious. It concerns a gigantic bird, the epiornis, of which the bones and the enormous eggs were discovered in Madagascar about the year 1850. It is an instance proving the caution needed before rejecting as fictitious many apparently fabulous legends, but which on examination may prove to possess a substratum of truth. To the north of Greater Java, says Pigafetta, in the Gulf of China, there is a very large tree called Kempinganhi, inhabited by certain birds called garrula, which are so large and strong that they can bear away a buffalo and even an elephant, and carry it as they fly to the place where the tree Pusathere is. This legend has been current ever since the 9th century among the Persians and Arabs, and this bird plays a wonderful part in Arabian tales under the name of the roc. It is not surprising, therefore, that Pigafetta found an analogous tradition among the Malays. After leaving Greater Java, the Victoria rounded the peninsula of Malacca, which had been subjugated to Portugal by the great Albuquerque 10 years before. In the immediate neighborhood are Siam and Cambodia and Chiampa, where rhubarb grows. This substance is discovered in the following manner. A company of from 20 to 25 men go into the wood, where they pass the night in the trees, to protect themselves from lions. Note here that there are no lions in this country and other ferocious beasts, and also that they may better perceive the odor of the rhubarb, which the wind wafts towards them. In the morning they go towards the place whence came the odor, and search there for the rhubarb until they find it. Rhubarb is the putrefied wood of a great tree, and acquires its odor even from its putrefaction. The best part of the tree is the root. Nevertheless, the trunk, which they call kalama, has the same medicinal virtue. Decidedly, it is not from Pigafetta that we should seek to acquire botanical knowledge. We should run a great risk of deceiving ourselves if we took in earnest the nonsense that the Moor told him, from whom he drew his information. The Lombard traveler gives us also fantastic details about China with the greatest seriousness, and falls into the grave errors which his contemporary Duarte Barbosa had avoided. It is to the latter we owe the information that the trade in anthium or opium has existed from this period. When once the Victoria had left the shores of Malacca, Sebastian del Cano took great care to avoid the coast of Zanzibar, where the Portuguese had been established since the beginning of the century. He kept to the open sea as far as 42 degrees south latitude, and for 9 weeks he was obliged to keep the sails furled on account of the constant west and northwest winds, which ended in a fearful storm. To keep to this course required great perseverance on the part of the captain, with a settled desire on his part to carry his enterprise to a successful issue. The vessel had several leaks, and a number of the sailors demanded an anchorage at Mozambique. For the provisions which were not salted having become bad, the crew had only rice and water for food and drink. At last, on the 6th of May, the Cape of Tempests was doubled, and a favorable issue to the voyage might be hoped for. Nevertheless, many vexatious accidents still awaited the navigator. In 2 months, 21 men, Europeans and Indians, died from privations, and if on the 9th July they had not landed at Santiago, one of the Cape de Verde Islands, the whole crew would have died of hunger. As this archipelago belonged to Portugal, the sailors took care to say that they came from America, and carefully concealed the route which they had discovered. But one of the sailors, having had the imprudence to say that the Victoria was the only vessel of Magellan's squadron which had returned to Europe, the Portuguese immediately seized the crew of a longboat and prepared to attack the Spanish vessel. However, Del Cano on board his vessel was watching all the movements of the Portuguese, and suspecting, by the preparations which he saw, that there was an intention of seizing the Victoria, he set sail, leaving 13 men of his crew in the hands of the Portuguese. Maximilian Transilvain assigns a different motive from the one given by Pigafetta for the anchorage at the Cape de Verde Islands. He asserts that the fatigued state of the crew, who were reduced by privations, and who in spite of everything had not ceased to work the pumps, had decided the captain to stop and buy some slaves to aid them in this work. Having no money, the Spaniards would have paid with some of their spices, which would have opened the eyes of the Portuguese. To see if our journals were correctly kept, says Pigafetta, we inquired on shore what day of the week it was. They replied that it was Thursday, which surprised us, because according to our journals, it was as yet only Wednesday. We could not be persuaded that we had made the mistake of a day. I was more astonished myself than the others were, because having always been sufficiently well to keep my journal, I had uninterruptedly marked the days of the week and the course of the months. We learnt afterwards that there was no error in our calculation, for having always traveled towards the west, following the course of the sun, and having returned to the same point, we must have gained 24 hours upon those who had remained stationary. One has only need of reflection to be convinced of this fact. Sebastian del Cano rapidly made the coast of Africa, and on the 6th of September entered the bay of San Lucar de Barrameda with a crew of 17 men, almost all of whom were ill. 2 days later, he anchored before the mole at Seville, after having accomplished a complete circuit of the world. As soon as he arrived, Sebastian del Cano went to Valladolid, where the court was, and received from Charles V the welcome which was merited after so many difficulties had been courageously overcome. The bold mariner received permission to take as his armorial bearings a globe with this motto, Primus circumdedisti me, and he also received a pension of 500 ducats. The rich freight of the Victoria decided the emperor to send a second fleet to the Moluccas. The supreme command of it was not, however, given to Sebastian del Cano. It was reserved for the commander Garcia de Loaisa, whose only claim to it was his grand name. However, after the death of the chief of the expedition, which happened as soon as the fleet had passed the Strait of Magellan, del Cano found himself invested with the command, but he did not hold it long, for he died 6 days afterwards. As for the ship Victoria, she was long preserved in the port of Seville, but in spite of all the care that was taken of her, she at length fell to pieces from old age. Chapter 3. The Polar Expeditions and the Search for the Northwest Passage. 1. The Northmen Eric the Red, the Xenos John Cabot Corterial, Sebastian Cabot, Willoughby Chancellor. Pythias had opened up the road to the north to the Scandinavians by discovering Iceland, the famous Thule, and the Cronian Ocean, of which the mud, the shallow water, and the ice render the navigation dangerous, and where the nights are as light as twilight. The traditions of the voyages undertaken by the ancients to the Orkneys, the Faroe Islands, and even to Iceland were treasured up among the Irish monks, who were learned men and themselves bold mariners, as their successive establishments in these archipelagos clearly prove. They were also the pilots of the Northmen, a name given generally to the Scandinavian pirates, both Danish and Norwegian, who rendered themselves so formidable to the whole of Europe during the Middle Ages. But if all the information that we owe to the ancients, both Greeks and Romans, with regard to these Hyperborean countries be extremely vague and so to speak fabulous, it is not so with that which concerns the adventurous enterprises of the men of the North. The sagas, as the Icelandic and Danish songs are called, are extremely precise, and the numerous data which we owe to them are daily confirmed by the archaeological discoveries made in America, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, and Denmark. This is a source of valuable information which was long unknown and unexplored, and of which we owe the revelation to the learned Dane, C.C. Raffin, who has furnished us with authentic facts of the greatest interest bearing on the pre-Columbian discovery of America. Norway was poor and encumbered with population. Hence arose the necessity for a permanent emigration, which should allow a considerable portion of the inhabitants to seek in more favored regions the nourishment which a frozen soil denied them. When they had found some country rich enough to yield them an abundant spoil, they then returned to their own land and set out the following spring, accompanied by all those who could be enticed either by the love of lucre, the desire for an easy life, or by the thirst for strife. Intrepid hunters and fishermen, accustomed to a dangerous navigation between the continent and the mass of islands which border it and appear to defend it against the assaults of the ocean, and across the narrow, deep fjords, which seem as though they were cut into the soil itself by some gigantic sword, They set out in those oak vessels, the sight of which made the people tremble who lived on the shores of the North Sea and British Channel. Sometimes decked, these vessels, long or short, large or small, were usually terminated in front by a spur of enormous size, above which the prow sometimes rose to a great height, taking the form of an S, the Holrestninger, for so they call the graphic representations so often met with on the rocks of Sweden and Norway, enable us to picture to ourselves these swift vessels, which could carry a considerable crew. Such was the Long Serpent of Olaf Tryggvason, which had 32 benches of rowers and held 90 men, Canut's vessel, which carried 60, and the 2 vessels of Olaf the Saint, which carried sometimes 200 men. The Sea Kings, as they often called these adventurers, lived on the ocean, never settling on shore, passing from the pillage of a castle to the burning of an abbey, devastating the coasts of France, ascending rivers, especially the Seine, as far as Paris, sailing over the Mediterranean as far as Constantinople, establishing themselves later in Sicily, and leaving traces of their incursions or their sojourn in all the regions of the known world. Norman ships. Norman ships. Piracy, far from being, as at the present day, an act falling under the ban of the law, was not only encouraged in that barbarous or half-civilized society, but was celebrated in the songs of the skalds, who reserved their most enthusiastic eulogies for celebrating chivalrous struggles, adventurous privateering, and all exhibitions of strength. From the 8th century, these formidable sea rovers frequented the groups of the Orkney, the Hebrides, the Shetland, and Faroe Islands, where they met with the Irish monks, who had settled themselves there nearly a century earlier to instruct the idolatrous population. In 861, a Norwegian pirate named Nadard was carried by a storm towards an island covered with snow, which he named Snowland, Land of Snow, a name changed later to that of Iceland, Land of Ice. There again the Northmen found the Irish monks under the name of Pappies in the cantons of Papia and Papili. Ingolf installed himself some years afterwards in the country and founded Reykjavik. In 885, the triumph of Harald Harfager, who had just subjugated the whole of Norway by force of arms, brought a considerable number of malcontents to Iceland. They established there the republican form of government, which had just been overthrown in their own country, and which subsisted the epoch when Iceland passed under the dominion of the kings of Norway. When established in Iceland, these bold fellows, lovers of adventure and of long hunts in pursuit of seals and walrus, retained their wandering habits and pursued their bold plans in the west, where only 3 years after the arrival of Ingolf, Gunnbjorn discovered the snowy peaks of the mountains of Greenland. 5 years later, Eric the Red, banished from Iceland for murder, rediscovered the land in latitude 64 degrees north, of which Gunnbjorn had caught a glimpse. The sterility of this icebound coast made him decide to seek a milder climate with a more open country, and one producing more game in the south. So he rounded Cape Farewell at the extremity of Greenland, established himself on the west coast, and built some vast dwellings for himself and his companions, of which M. Jorgensen has discovered the ruins. This country was worthy at that period of the name of Greenland, Groenland, which the Northmen gave to it, but the annual and great increase of the glaciers has rendered it since that epoch a land of desolation. Eric returned to Iceland to seek his friends, and in the same year that he returned to Brattahalida, for so he called his settlement, 14 vessels laden with emigrants came to join him. It was a veritable exodus. These events took place in the year 1000. As quickly as the resources of the country allowed of it, the population of Greenland increased, and in 1121, Gardar, the capital of the country, became the seat of a bishopric, which existed until after the discovery of the Antilles by Christopher Columbus. In 986, Bjarn Heriolfsson, who had come from Norway to Iceland to spend the winter with his father, learnt that the latter had joined Eric the Red in Greenland. Without hesitation, the young man again put to sea, seeking at haphazard for a country of which he did not even know the exact situation, and was cast by currents on coasts which we think must have been those of New Scotland, Newfoundland, and Maine. He ended, however, by reaching Greenland, where Eric, the powerful Norwegian Jarl, reproached him for not having examined with more care countries of which he owed his knowledge to a happy accident of the sea. Eric had sent his son Leif to the Norwegian court. So close at this time was the connection between the metropolis and the colonies. The king, who had been converted to Christianity, had just dispatched a mission to Iceland charged to overthrow the worship of Odin. He committed to Leif's care some priests who were to instruct the Greenlanders. But scarcely had the young adventurer returned to his own country when he left the holy men to work out the accomplishment of their difficult task, and hearing of the discovery made by Bjarn, he fitted out his vessels and went to seek for the lands which had been only imperfectly seen. He landed first on a desolate and stony plain, to which he gave the name of Helluland, and which we have no hesitation in recognizing as Newfoundland, and afterwards on a flat sandy shore behind which rose an immense screen of dark forests, cheered by the songs of innumerable birds. A third time he put to sea, and steering towards the south he arrived at the Bay of Rhode Island, where the mild climate and the river teeming with salmon induced him to settle, and where he constructed vast buildings of planks, which he called Leifsbudir, Leif's house. Then he sent some of his companions to explore the country, and they returned with the good news that the wild vine grows in the country, to which it owes the name of Vinland. In the spring of the year 1001, Leif, having laded his ship with skins, grapes, wood, and other productions of the country, set out for Greenland. He had made the valuable observation that the shortest day in Vinland lasted 9 hours, which places the site of Leifsbudir at 41 degrees 24'10". This fortunate voyage and the salvage of a Norwegian vessel carrying 15 men gained for Leif the surname of the Fortunate. This expedition made a great stir, and the account of the wonders of the country in which Leif had settled induced his brother Thorvald to set out with 30 men. After passing the winter at Leifsbudir, Thorvald explored the coasts to the south, returning in the autumn to Vinland, and in the following year 1004 he sailed along the coast to the north of Leifsbudir. During this return voyage, the Northmen met with the Esquimaux for the first time, and without any provocation, slaughtered them without mercy. The following night they found themselves all at once surrounded by a numerous flotilla of kayaks, from which came a cloud of arrows. Thorvald alone, the chief of the expedition, was mortally wounded. He was buried by his companions on a promontory, to which they gave the name of the Promontory of the Cross. Now in the Gulf of Boston in the 18th century, a tomb of masonry was discovered, in which with the bones was found a sword hilt of iron. The Indians not being acquainted with this metal, it could not be one of their skeletons. It was not either the remains of one of the Europeans who had landed after the 15th century, for their swords had not this very characteristic form. This tomb has been thought to be that of a Scandinavian, and we venture to say that of Thorvald, son of Eric the Red. In the spring of 1007, 3 vessels carrying 160 men and some cattle left Eriksfjord. The object in view was the foundation of a permanent colony. The emigrants, after sighting Helluland, Markland, and Vinland, landed in an island, upon which they constructed some barracks and began the work of cultivation. But they must either have laid their plans badly or have been wanting in foresight, for the winter found them without provisions, and they suffered cruelly from hunger. They had, however, the good sense to regain the continent, where in comparative ease they could await the end of the winter. At the beginning of 1008, they set out to seek for Leifsbudir, and settled themselves at Mount Hope Bay, on the opposite shore to the old settlement of Leif. There, for the first time, some intercourse was held with the natives, called Skrellings in the sagas, and whom, from the manner in which they are portrayed, it is easy to recognize as Esquimaux. The first meeting was peaceable, and barter was carried on with them until the day when the desire of the Esquimaux to acquire iron hatchets, always prudently refused them by the Northmen, drove them to acts of aggression, which decided the newcomers, after 3 years of residence, to return to their own country, which they did without leaving behind them any lasting trace of their stay in the country. It will be easily understood that we cannot give any detailed account of all the expeditions which set out from Greenland and succeeded each other on the coasts of Labrador and the United States. Those of our readers who wish for circumstantial details should refer to M. Gabriel Gravier's interesting publication, the most complete work on the subject, and from which we have borrowed all that relates to the Norman expeditions. The same year as Eric the Red landed in Greenland, 983, a certain Hari Marson, being driven out of the ordinary course by storms, was cast upon the shores of a country known by the name of White Man's Land, which extended according to Raffin from Chesapeake Bay to Florida. What is the meaning of this name, White Man's Land? Had some compatriots of Marson's already settled there? There is some reason to suppose so. Even from the words used in the chronicle, we can understand how interesting it would be to be able to determine the nationality of these first colonists. However, the sagas have not as yet revealed all their secrets. There are probably some of them still unknown, and as those which have been successively discovered have confirmed facts already admitted, there is every reason to hope that our knowledge of Icelandic navigation may become more precise. Another legend, of which great part is mere romance, but which nevertheless contains a foundation of truth, relates that a certain Bjorn, who was obliged to quit Iceland in consequence of an unfortunate passion, took refuge in the countries beyond Vinland, where in 1027 he was found by some of his countrymen. In 1051, during another expedition, an Icelandic woman was killed by some Skrellings, and in 1867 a tomb was exhumed, bearing a runic inscription and containing bones and some articles of the toilet, which are now preserved in the museum at Washington. This discovery was made at the exact spot indicated in the saga which related these events, and which was not itself discovered unt. But the Northmen, established in Iceland and Greenland, were not the only people who frequented the coast of America about the year 1000, which is proved by the name of Great Ireland, which was given to White Man's Land. As the history of Madacapoin proves, the Irish and Welsh founded colonies there, regarding which we have but little information, but vague and uncertain as it is. Davizak and Gaffill agree in recognizing its probability. Having now said a few words upon the travels and settlements of the Northmen in Labrador, Vinland, and the more southern countries, we must return to the north. The colonies first founded in the neighborhood of Cape Farewell had not been slow in stretching along the western coast, which at this period was infinitely less desolate than it is at the present day, as far as northern latitudes, which were not again reached until our own day. Thus at this time they caught seals, walrus, and whales in the Bay of Disco. There were 190 towns counted then in Westerbygd and 86 in Esterbygd, while at the present day there are far fewer Danish settlements on these icy shores. These towns were probably only inconsiderable groups of those houses in stone and wood, of which so many ruins have been found from Cape Farewell as far as Upernavik in about 72 degrees 50. At the same time, numerous runic inscriptions, which have now been deciphered, have given a degree of absolute certainty to facts so long unknown. But how many of these vestiges of the past still remain to be discovered? How many of these valuable evidences of the bravery and spirit of enterprise of the Scandinavian race are forever buried under the glaciers? The glaciers of Greenland. The glaciers of Greenland. We have also obtained evidence that Christianity had been brought into America and especially into Greenland. To this country, according to the instructions of Pope Gregory Roman IV, there were pastoral visits made to strengthen the newly converted Northmen in the faith and to evangelize the Esquimaux and the Indian tribes. Besides this, M. Ryant in 1865 has proved incontrovertibly that the Crusades were preached in Greenland in the bishopric of Gardar, as well as in the islands and neighboring lands, and that up to 1418, Greenland paid to the Holy See tithes and St. Peter's pence, which for that year consisted of 2,600 pounds of walrus tusks. The Norwegian colonies owe their downfall and ruin to various causes. To the very rapid extension of the glaciers, Hayes has proved that the glacier of Friar John moves at the rate of about 33 yards annually, to the bad policy of the mother country, which prevented the recruiting of the colonies, to the Black Plague, which decimated the population of Greenland fro to 1351, lastly, to the depredations of the pirates, who ravaged these already enfeebled countries in 1418, and in whom some have thought they recognized certain inhabitants of the Orkney and Faroe Islands, of which we are now about to speak. one of the companions of William the Conqueror, named St. Clair or Sinclair, not thinking that the portion of the conquered country allotted to him was proportioned to his merits, went to try his luck in Scotland, where he was not long in rising to fortune and honors. In the latter half of the 14th century, the Orkney Islands passed into the hands of his descendants. About 1390, a certain Niccolo Zeno, a member of one of the most ancient and noble Venetian families, who had fitted out a vessel at his own expense to visit England and Flanders as a matter of curiosity, was wrecked in the archipelago of the Orkneys, whither he had been driven by a storm. He was about to be massacred by the inhabitants when the Earl, Henry Sinclair, took him under his protection. The history of this wreck, and the adventures and discoveries which followed it, published in the collection of Ramusio, had been written by Antonio Zeno, says Clements Markham, the learned geographer, in his Threshold of the Unknown Region. Unfortunately, one of his descendants named Niccolo Zeno, born in 1515, when a boy, not knowing the value of these papers, tore them up. But some of the letters surviving, he was able from them subsequently to compile the narrative as we now have it, and which was printed in Venice in 1558. There was also found in the palace an old map, rotten with age, illustrative of his voyages. Of this he made a copy, unluckily supplying from his own reading of the narrative what he thought was requisite for its illustration. By doing this in a blundering way, unaided by the geographical knowledge which enables us to see where he goes astray, he threw the whole of the geography which he derived from the narrative into the most lamentable confusion, while those parts of the map which are not thus sophisticated, and which are consequently original, present an accuracy far in advance by many generations of the geography even of Niccolo Zeno's time, and confirm in a notable manner the site of the old Greenland colony. In these facts, we have not only the solution of all the discussions which have arisen on the subject, but the most indisputable proof of the authenticity of the narrative. For it is clear that Niccolo Zeno, Jr., could not himself have been the ingenious concocter of a story, the straightforward truth of which he could thus ignorantly distort upon the face of the map. The name of Zichmni, in which writers of the present day, and chief among them Mr. H. Major, who has rescued these facts from the domain of fable, recognize the name of Sinclair, appears to be in fact only applicable to this Earl of the Orkneys. At this time, the seas of the north of Europe were infected by Scandinavian pirates. Sinclair, who had recognized in Zeno a clever mariner, attached him to himself, and with him conquered the country of Friesland, the haunt of pirates, who ravaged all the north of Scotland. In the maps at the end of the 15th and beginning of the 16th century, this name is applied to the archipelago of the Faroe Islands, a reasonable indication, for Buech has recognized in the present names of the harbors and islands of this archipelago a considerable number of those given by Zeno. Finally, the facts which we owe to the Venetian navigator about the waters, abounding in fish and dangerous from shallows, which divide this archipelago, are still true at the present day. Satisfied with his position, Zeno wrote to his brother Antonio to come and join him. While Sinclair was conquering the Faroe Islands, the Norwegian pirates desolated the Shetland Islands, then called Eastland. Niccolo set sail to give them battle, but was himself obliged to fly before their fleet, much more numerous than his own, and to take refuge on a small island on the coast of Iceland. After wintering in this place, Zeno must have landed the following year on the eastern coast of Greenland at 69 degrees north latitude, in a place where was a monastery of the Order of Preaching Friars and a church dedicated to St. Thomas. The cells were warmed by a natural spring of hot water, which the monks used to prepare their food and to bake their bread. The monks had also gardens covered over in the winter season and warmed by the same means, so that they were able to produce flowers, fruits, and herbs, as well as if they had lived in a mild climate. There would seem to be some confirmation of these narratives in the fact that between the years 1828-1830, a captain of the Danish Navy met with a population of 600 individuals at 69 degrees north latitude, of a purely European type.